taxes. We raised the income tax rate to over 50%, which means we're taking over half of what people make at the top level for high incomes. What that means, because it's a progressive tax, we're not taking near that much for poor people. For rich people, we're taking over half. That means that entrepreneurs, instead of having an incentive to go out there and invest and create new products, no incentive. Put the money in a tax-exempt bond, an art collection, stamp collection, anything to avoid having to pay those high taxes. You don't put it in capital, in industry, this kind of thing. If you look at that combination, it's a 1-2-3 punch. Federal Reserve making money harder to borrow, Smoot-Hawley tariff, crimping our exports, and then the high income tax making it hard for investors to invest. Government created problem, and we had 25% unemployment in 1932. Roosevelt was obviously going to be in a good position to be reelected, which is another point of comparison I want to make between Obama and Roosevelt. Both of them responding to these crises heavily created by government behavior, turned in both cases to government as a solution to the problem. In the case of President Obama, of course, we saw the stimulus package, and we've seen a variety of spending on health care proposed, this kind of thing. We have a new jobs bill that's right before Congress. So we've had a variety of spending approaches by President Obama and a dramatic increase in the national debt. In the case of Roosevelt, also a flurry of spending. I'm going to get into 3 programs. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the NRA, which is not anything with guns. This is the National Recovery Act. And then the third one is the WPA, Works Progress Administration, and they built roads and that kind of thing. And I wanted to talk about those 3. There are others, of course, as well. But I'm just saying, Roosevelt also a flurry of spending. What's interesting is, with all of that spending all of a sudden coming into the economy, federal spending, in both cases, of course here we only have, in the case of President Obama, we only have a year to gauge. No. But I'm saying, so in Roosevelt we have all of his administration, so I realize I can't make a comparison beyond 1 year for President Obama. But in the case of 1 year, unemployment, as we know, has gone up. It is now almost 10%. And in the case of Roosevelt, after 4 years, it was 15%. Now, he would say that was still better than 25%, but then it went back up to 20%. So we reach a situation where all of that flurry of spending doesn't really help us in the way of unemployment. Let me put it this way. If we look at all of the unemployment problems that we've ever had in U.S. history, before the Great Depression, the worst unemployment rate we ever had in U.S. history before the Great Depression was 17%. And that was for a very brief period in the 1890s. After 2 terms of Franklin Roosevelt, 1939, unemployment was 20.7%. In other words, 10 years after the Great Depression, almost 8 years after Roosevelt was in office, we still had unemployment of about 20%. The Great Depression, and the New Deal, I should say, did not reduce unemployment significantly. Unemployment is still at record levels. The New Deal, in that sense, is a failure for sure. With President Obama, we're still only 1 year into it. The parallel is there. Let me give you a quotation here from Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury. I thought this was a good, useful quotation. I used it to begin the book. I thought it was helpful because Secretary of Treasury is a key person in the economic tactics. In the case of Roosevelt, he put really one of his 2 or 3 best friends in his whole life in as Secretary of Treasury. His name was Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau and Roosevelt had known each other for decades before Roosevelt became president. The 2 of them lived close to each other. They were longtime friends. They both campaigned for the Democratic Party. Their wives were good friends and went shopping together. Their wives were both named Eleanor. And Morgenthau was always a good friend of Roosevelt. In fact, Morgenthau had in his office at the Treasury a picture of Roosevelt, which Roosevelt had signed. It was a picture of both of them together, Morgenthau and Roosevelt. And Roosevelt had signed underneath it, "To Henry, from one of two of a kind." In other words, they were good friends. In cabinet meetings, they would sometimes pass notes to each other and this kind of thing. They'd have lunches and dinners and this kind of thing. Well, Morgenthau said this in 1939, trying to deal with this 20% unemployment business. He'd been Treasury Secretary for most of the 2 terms. Here's what he says. "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I'm wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." President Roosevelt, in his first 2 terms, doubled the national debt. In other words, from the Revolutionary War up to the election of Franklin Roosevelt, our 32nd president, we accumulated $20 billion national debt. In 8 years of his presidency, we had $20 billion more. President Obama is on track to exactly duplicate that. We have a national debt of $8 trillion coming into his presidency, and you see different variations. Some have it actually worse than double. Some slightly less, but it looks like about 16 billion. A doubling is projected there as well. So parallel we see there. Part of this here is these programs that Roosevelt had that we need to get into. I want to talk about them. I mentioned the AAA, the NRA, and the WPA. Those are the heart of the New Deal, and I wanted to spend some emphasis on those, just to discuss and see how they're working or how they're not working. The AAA, the heart of this, it's connected, and you can understand farmers need help because you can't export. You can't export because other countries won't buy your stuff, because we won't buy their stuff. Now, this is something that if I were your professor here at Wabash, and I would say to you, we're not going to have adults who supposedly know what they're doing try to figure this out. I want you to figure it out. Does anybody have an idea? Yeah. I'm looking for advice. We've got farm prices in the tank.
Subsidized farmers.
Now that's the direction the adults came up with. That's why I want to give the students a chance. I'm convinced the students can do better. Any thoughts?
Start saving money.
Start saving money. Well, I don't know. Maybe when I was your age, it occurred to me, you know, I would ask this question in class, and it would be like, I'd say, why doesn't somebody repeal the Smoot-Hawley tariff? Right. I mean, maybe if somebody repealed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that would be a resolution of part of the problem. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt said in his campaign that he was going to do that, but he never did. It's interesting to ponder, isn't it? If you repeal the tariff, then everybody, you've got all these high tariff walls, and then you're taking them down, and you say, we'll buy your stuff. And they say, oh, okay, we'll buy your stuff. And then we get free trade flow.